According to the oldest stories, this presence wasn't born a monster. It became one, and that single detail changes everything. Imagine waking up in the absolute stillness of the night. Your eyes are open. You are entirely aware of the velvet darkness of your room. You try to draw a deep, cleansing breath, but a heavy, invisible weight has settled across your chest. You try to move a single finger, but your body refuses to respond. You attempt to call out for help, to whisper a name, but your vocal cords are frozen. You are a prisoner within your own physical form. And then you feel it, a cold, watching presence in the corner of the room, a shadow that slowly detaches itself from the wall and glides toward the foot of your bed. For generations, across the mist-covered valleys of Europe, this terrifying midnight experience was not considered a trick of the mind. It was recognized as a visitation, a physical assault by a tangible, shadowy traveler known as the Alp. And while modern science has given this phenomenon a clinical name, the ancient texts describe an entity far more sinister than a simple bad dream. They describe a creature that does not hunt for food, nor does it seek out treasure. It hunts for your very breath. But that wasn't the strangest part. What exactly is the Alp? To understand this entity, we have to look at the silent hours of the night. The Alp is a nocturnal being from Germanic folklore, an entity deeply connected to the phenomenon we now call sleep paralysis. In fact, the German word for nightmare, Albtraum, literally translates to elf dream. But this is not the elegant, glowing elf of modern fantasy. This is a heavy, suffocating force. When the Alp chooses a target, it does not strike with claws or weapons. Its method is far more intimate and deeply unsettling. It approaches the helpless, slumbering victim and physically sits astride their chest. At first, it feels as light as a feather, but as the minutes tick by, the entity begins to grow heavier, pressing down with an impossible, crushing pressure. This terrifying embrace is known in the old texts as the Alpdruck, or elf pressure. As the victim lies there, fully conscious but completely paralyzed, the Alp leans down. It places its face perilously close to the sleeper, and then it begins to siphon their life essence. It draws the vital warmth and breath directly from their lips, drinking the invisible energy that keeps mortals tethered to the waking world. The victims awaken in the morning pale, exhausted, and feeling as though their very soul has been slowly drained away. However, the legend becomes even more mysterious, because the Alp does not merely vanish without a trace. It leaves physical, undeniable proof of its midnight visit. If you were to look closely at a victim the morning after an attack, you might find their hair tangled into dense, impossible knots that defy any comb or brush. These chaotic tangles were known as elf knots. In the old days, these sudden, stone-like braids were feared as physical marks of a shadowy influence, requiring special wandering practitioners to carefully cut them away and cast them into ancient ruins to appease the unseen forces. Yet one detail doesn't fit. If this creature is a physical being capable of leaving tangled hair and causing crushing pressure, how does it enter a perfectly locked room with no open windows? The most terrifying aspect of the Alp is not its immense weight. It is its absolute mastery of space and form. The Alp is a profound shapeshifter. When it travels through the moonlit countryside, it rarely walks in its true form. Instead, it alters its physical state to blend into the shadows. It might approach a farmhouse as a shaggy, silent dog, a heavy pig, a creeping cat, or a slithering snake. It can shrink itself down to the size of a tiny vole, or even condense its essence into a delicate, fluttering white butterfly. Because of this incredible ability, a locked door means absolutely nothing to the Alp. It can compress its entire being to slip silently through a keyhole, or glide through a tiny knothole in the wooden floorboards. But there is a contradiction, a strange, almost comical flaw in the creature's perfect disguise. No matter what animal shape the Alp assumes, whether it is a massive bear or a tiny butterfly, it always wears a hat. This is the Tarnkap, an ancient magical cap or veil of concealment The Alp draws its supernatural strength, its ability to fade from human sight, and its power to change shapes entirely from this specific item. And bound by an inescapable ancient law, the Tarnkappet remains perfectly visible. If you happen to spot a common house cat slinking through your room wearing a tiny white hat, you are looking at a nocturnal predator preparing to strike. If a mortal is quick enough and brave enough to snatch the hat from the entity's head, the Alp is instantly stripped of all its power. Trapped in the physical world and unable to turn invisible, it will weep and plead, offering vast fortunes and hidden secrets in exchange for the safe return of its precious cap. Most people never hear what happened next, because if these entities wear clothing and bargain for their belongings, it raises a deeply unsettling question. Where did they actually come from? The origins of the Alp are scattered across time, and each explanation is more disturbing than the last. In many isolated mountain villages, it was whispered that the Alp was not a demon from the deep underworld. It was the restless spirit of a recently departed relative. Unable to find peace in the great beyond, these lingering shadows returned to their former homes. Driven by a cold jealousy of the living, they sought out the beds of their loved ones, siphoning their warmth just to feel the spark of vitality one last time. But that wasn't the only way an Alp could be born. In some traditions, the curse of the Alp was the tragic result of mortal desperation. If a mother, enduring a long and agonizing childbirth, bit down into a wooden horse collar to silence her screams, her child would be marked by a dark fate. The child would grow up normally, but upon reaching maturity, they would undergo a midnight transition, slipping out of their physical bodies to wander the night as an Alp. Sometimes, individuals with eyebrows that met deeply in the middle were viewed with deep suspicion, believed to carry the seed of the shadow within them. And that's where the story takes a strange turn. At the borders of Eastern Europe, a completely different, almost cosmic origin emerges. In these lands, folklore speaks of a colossal ancient entity resting in the underworld known as the Horzy. From its massive lungs, this deep earth demon exhales endless, shimmering swarms of shape-shifting butterflies. These delicate creatures are the Alps in their dormant state. They fly up into the mortal realm, seek out the sleeping, and when their midnight harvest is complete, they dissolve back into the mist, returning to the yawning jaws of their ancient master. Yet, there is an even older legend, a story that traces the shadow all the way back to the deserts of Assyria. It tells of a beautiful and ambitious queen named Albiona, who plotted with her 31 sisters to bring a sudden and dark end to their husbands. When their conspiracy was discovered, they were banished to the sea on a ship with no sails. They drifted until they crashed upon a misty island, coupling with ancient forest spirits to give birth to a lineage of nocturnal wanderers. With so many dark origins, it seemed no one was safe. The truly unsettling part is that the Alp didn't just target the people inside the house. The malicious hunger of the Alp extended far beyond the bedroom. It reached into the barns and the pastures, targeting the most prized possessions of any rural family. Farmers would often wake at the first light of dawn, walk out into the crisp morning air, and swing open the heavy wooden doors of their stables. Inside, they would find their finest, strongest horses trembling in the cold. The animals would be covered in a thick lather of sweat, completely exhausted, as though they had been ridden at a full gallop through an endless, unseen landscape all night long. Their manes would be tightly braided into intricate, unbreakable elf knots. The Alp, acting as a night rider, would take the physical forms of the beasts on spectral journeys, draining their energy just as it drained the breath from humans. It also possessed a dark craving for the milk of nursing animals, slipping into the stalls to drain the dairy cows, leaving the herds weak and unable to stand by morning. This constant, invisible siege on both the family and their livelihood meant that people could not simply lock their doors and hope for the best. They had to fight back. But how do you fight a creature that can turn into a shadow and slip through a keyhole? Because the threat of the Alp was an ever-present shadow, the people developed a brilliant, desperate system of defensive magic. The first line of defense was to confuse the entity's ancient senses. Before going to sleep, careful homeowners would place their shoes directly next to the bed, but with the toes pointing strictly toward the door. This symbolic ward signaled an immediate departure, confusing the Alp's sense of direction and forcing it to turn away. Others would lay a heavy iron horseshoe over the bedpost, or hide a simple broomstick beneath their pillow, trusting the raw elements of iron and straw to disrupt the creature's magic. A mirror placed flat upon the chest of the sleeper was highly effective, designed to catch the reflection of the Alp's own mystical gaze and turn its destructive power back upon itself. However, the legend becomes much darker. What if you woke up, paralyzed, and realized the wards had failed? What if the Alp was already sitting on your chest? If you managed to break the paralysis just enough to speak, you could invoke the ancient rule of mock hospitality. You would stare directly into the shadow and say, "Come back in the morning, and I will lend you what you need, or buy you a cup of coffee." Bound by the strict, supernatural laws of hospitality, the entity would immediately flee. The following morning, there would be a sharp knock at the door. Standing on the threshold would be a neighbor, often someone in their true human form, humbly asking to borrow a cup of sugar. By offering the gift, the homeowner secured a promise that the shadow would never return to their bedchamber. But there was a problem. What if you didn't want to just banish it? What if you wanted to trap the shadow and force it into the light? This brings us to the most astonishing account in the entire lore of the Alp. A story that reveals a terrifying vulnerability in the creature's design. The Alp is bound by one absolute unbreakable law of physics. It can only exit a room through the exact same opening it used to enter. According to a famous legend from the region of Pomerania, a young apprentice was wasting away, his vitality siphoned night after night by an invisible tormentor. Desperate, he begged a brave companion to watch over him in the dark. As the midnight hour struck, the companion watched in horror as the apprentice began to gasp, his chest violently compressed by empty air. Moving silently, the companion took a pre-carved wooden wedge and hammered it firmly into a small knothole in the door. He then called the apprentice by his baptismal name, instantly shattering the paralyzing spell. The two young men lit a candle and searched the room. There was no monster, no shadow, but resting quietly on the floorboards near the plugged door was a single ordinary piece of straw. Sensing a supernatural trick, they carefully picked up the straw, carried it to their workbench, and clamped it tightly into the iron jaws of a heavy vice. What happened at sunrise changed the legend forever. When the first rays of morning light touched the workbench, the straw underwent a shocking, violent transformation. It materialized into a beautiful, pale young woman, her arm firmly crushed within the iron jaws of the vice. Stripped of her magic and trapped in the physical world, she wept bitterly. The apprentice, moved by her sorrow, released her. Over time, the two were married, built a prosperous life, and raised several children together. That should have been the end of the story. But years later, during a heated argument, the husband grew arrogant. He mocked his wife, claiming she knew nothing of her true past. When she quietly replied that she truly had no memory of where she came from, the foolish husband walked over to the old door. He pulled the wooden wedge from the knothole and laughed. "This is the very hole through which you came." In that exact instant, the woman's physical form dissolved. She slipped like a cold mist through the newly opened hole and vanished into the morning air, never to be seen in human form again. The truly unsettling part is what this means for us today. Because this entity didn't just vanish into the past. It followed humanity straight into the modern era. As the world moved into the Romantic period, the terror of the Alp stepped out of rural folklore and onto the canvas. In 1781, the artist Henry Fuseli created a masterpiece titled The Nightmare. It depicted a woman lying entirely limp across a bed. having surrendered all physical control. Crouched directly upon her chest is a hideous, goblin-like demon, the visual embodiment of the Alp. Through the velvet curtains behind them, a spectral horse with pale, empty eyes peers into the room. This painting didn't just capture a myth. It captured a universal human trauma. It became so iconic that pioneers of psychology kept copies of it in their offices, trying to understand why this specific fear is hardwired into the human brain. The legend of the Alp was so potent that the legendary writer Goethe included its protective symbols, the Drudenfuß, in his masterpiece Faust, to ward off dark entities. Today, the Alp survives in our digital worlds. In the dark fantasy universe of The Witcher, the Alp is reimagined as a terrifying, fast-moving vampiric entity. In the tactical game Battle Brothers, the Alp remains perfectly true to its ancient roots. It drifts into villages at night, avoids physical combat, and systematically puts mercenaries to sleep, feeding on their life essence through inescapable visions of terror. Modern science looks at all of this and offers a comforting explanation. We are told it is simply sleep paralysis, a harmless glitch in the brain where your mind wakes up before your muscles do, creating a hallucination of pressure and a shadowy figure. But does knowing the clinical name really change the experience? When you awaken in the dead of night, when the silence rings in your ears, when you realize that your arms and legs are completely immobilized, and that heavy, slow weight begins to press down upon your ribs, in that terrifying, helpless moment between the dream world and waking reality, science feels very far away. The legend of the Alp endures because it puts a face to our absolute deepest vulnerability. It is the realization that in our most private, secure spaces, when we close our eyes, we are no longer in control. So tonight, before you turn out the light and surrender yourself to sleep, you might want to double check the lock. And perhaps, just to be safe, make sure your shoes are pointing toward the door.